Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to graphic visualization today. All right. So today we're going to kick off starting class talking about NFTs, non-fungible tokens. So they're kind of the rage right now. Do you want to start the conversation about it, Josh? And I'll try to fill in some things.
It's very likely you have heard about this, but also very likely you haven't, because it's popped up so quickly and it's blown up so fast. But when I heard my own mother start texting me about NFTs, I realized it has probably gone pretty mainstream. So non-fungible token is hard to describe. It's a unique piece of code that you can place on the blockchain, generally done through Ethereum or something similar. And generally what these look like are little GIFs or videos or pieces of music or JPEG. But what it is, instead of just a digital file, is it's a representation of ownership. So when you buy one of these NFTs, it looks like you just bought a JPEG or a GIF or something, but you don't just own that, in fact, you don't own that in any capacity. You own the copyright in some sense to that piece of artwork. So you, for whatever that agreement might mean, which is still being fleshed out, own that piece of art. And what's so interesting about the space is that in real time, we're seeing it evolve, both what ownership means, what the agreement means between the parties, what can be considered an NFT, what can and then cannot, because some things are being said can't be NFTs. Very interestingly, Jack Dorsey just sold his first tweet from Twitter. Right. So that's just a piece of text, but is it? It's more of a civilizational event, I suppose. And who's to say who even owns that tweet? I mean, I guess Jack Dorsey, the one who tweeted, but the whole system is just really strange. And I think draws as many questions or raises questions. It's still being negotiated, and that's what makes the space so interesting and experimental. And having explored it and seen what people are doing, I think that's kind of the most interesting aspect, is these experimental kind of possibilities for what it could be. So yeah, we could share the screen and kind of talk about these.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. So we're going to start classes talking about two of the NFTs that we really like. Or a couple NFTs that we really like at the beginning of our classes moving forward. It's an opportunity to talk about design and kind of discuss art and work through the lens that we're all looking at stuff. And at the same time, this is like a contemporary thing. You should be able to share now.
Yeah, we'd be kind of remiss if we weren't talking about this during the year of NFTs. So let's see, that should be fine. Okay, you can see my screen.
Yep.
Yeah, this is how I wanted to kick this off. So I found this quote, and it's funny because this is a VJ I followed on I think Facebook and Instagram and stuff for years, and then I don't even know him. It's just an acquaintance or a friend of a friend, and he starts talking about NFTs because everyone is now, and you know, many of my colleagues and fellow artists and friends and designers are working in this space. And so I just love this quote that he put out recently. It says, 2021, the year that graphic artists can possibly earn just as much and more than bankers. Please at me only if you'd like to purchase my crypto-based digital artwork. And then everyone's placing memes, which I think is just perfect because memes play a very large part of the space so far and probably going forward for a long time, if not forever. And then something else he posted, digital art is finally being appreciated, respected, and valued in the crypto art markets as NFTs, and as up and coming artists use music as the driving force of my work. I'm trying to break through that glass ceiling. So I think this perfectly summarizes what's happening with these artists and people working in this space. Is there's this, at least so far, it's kind of a decentralized democracy creating feeling. It's if anything, it's progressive. These artists that couldn't make any money or made very little before kind of performing, which we all know in 2020 was taken back. Now they have this way to make money. And what the most interesting part is that it's actually working. These artists are selling their works as quickly as they can make them. And people that I personally know of, the most they've ever sold an artwork for is like $1,000 or something. And I know that they're making $5,000 selling these NFT art pieces, which is just absurd in the sense that they're not even physical things. But more on that, because we'll get back to that in a second with one of the ones that I wanted to talk about. So just to give more of a thing, and you might see that this definition will be a bit nebulous and somewhat on purpose, because what an NFT is still being defined. So we're going to be painting a broad picture about what's going on in the space, but we won't be telling you this is an NFT because it's still being put together. And who knows, this could be all gone and kind of kicked back in a few months. Although the first iteration was, I believe, in 2017 or a little bit earlier with CryptoKitties. And then it had a big fall and came back. So we're seeing sort of the second peak, but I'd say one of the more mainstream versions. This is kind of the first to take off. So here, if we go to Foundation app, this is a good place that shows if you're just interested in exploring what these NFTs could be. And what's really cool is that they show in real time what's being bid on. So you'll see that like automatically, just by definition, these NFTs are placed in the market because it's built on the blockchain, it's part of Ethereum, everything is a market. And so these things are being bid on, and when artists create them, they put a reserve bid, and then you can bid to try to buy one. And once the first bid is placed, at least on this market, then other people can bid, and after a certain amount of time, whoever bid the most owns the piece. What's kind of interesting about that is you can see not only who has created the piece of art, but you can also see who's purchased it once that happens. And since these are not entirely anonymous accounts, oftentimes you'll see that it's bought by a gallery or something along those things. So you can kind of, it naturally creates this web and ecosystem, and it's one of the more interesting aspects, I think, because it's showing artists how to kind of get into here, and it's creating its own kind of not just marketplace, but a advertising system. It's creating its own gallery network, like we have all the time before, but now in a new digital space. So Grumpy Cat, and the only way we know that this is actually whoever owns the Grumpy Cat, physical cat, who I believe has passed away now, or maybe not, but is because they were invited by Nyan Cat. So you see that this is set up as a sort of reputational based thing, as many things in the blockchain are. This is another iteration of Bitcoin and Ethereum, and it's an evolution of those projects. And it's almost dizzying how unregulated it is. This is the Wild West. Who's to say that this is actually the person that owns that GIF? I think it's been sort of proven on Twitter, and that's usually used as a kind of stake or a way to verify, kind of like the verified Twitter thing. And then that person that's been verified verifies the next one. So it's this web of reputation, and that creates the space. So we see these famous GIFs, and just the fact that someone sold this for 300 Ether, which is what, $500,000 maybe, is just stupendous. Yeah, $544,000. And what's cool about this being on the blockchain is you can see the chain of custody. So one person can buy this, the next person can buy it, the next person can buy it, and you can always see where it is. At least as far as I'm aware, there's no way to hide it, although you could buy it under an anonymous account, of course. And so you see that this has changed hands a few times. And another interesting aspect is these are built as contracts. So what's interesting is the original artist can, I believe, build into place that every time it changes hands through code, they receive 10%, let's say, and they can say what that percentage is, so that when it's sold, say you were Picasso, but you're selling your work on the blockchain, you might sell your original artwork for $10,000. It changes hands and sells for 20. You get 10% of that, and every time it changes hands for 50 years or something, you're always getting 10%. So very famously, one of the top VJs, people, I believe, just made through the second or third transaction, a number of millions of dollars, maybe $6 million, because it sold for $60 million. So just absurd amounts of money, which is interesting. But I'd say that that's one of the more interesting aspects of the space. People are playing with what happens when it changes hands, and they're writing into this additional things and agreements, some of which are done through code, like the percentage that the artist gets, but some of which are just agreements, and they're not bound by anything contractually, more just reputation. So I wanted to bring up one from an artist that both of us know, named Crispin. I think we've talked about him in some other classes, and we should definitely have him on this at some point. Good friend of mine, one of my favorite living artists. And he has been playing with these ideas of what an NFT is very directly and in a funny way, and I think in a pretty cool kind of conceptual framework as well. So right off the bat, these are his first NFTs that he made, and his first one, property ownership is a consensual hallucination, sold for about half an ether, so $500. This one, the list price of this artwork is 999 ether, so $2 million. The sale of this artwork will irreversibly change my life. Well, he hasn't sold it yet, but it's true that it will. And he's done stuff like this one will buy a car. Some of these are sort of tongue in cheek, but also interesting. I think it's similar to on the early days of the App Store. On the Apple App Store, there was an app called I Am Rich. And I think it was $1,000 or $10,000 for this little app, apps for 99 cents. And someone had the bright idea to make one that was $1,000 called I Am Rich. So if you bought that app for $1,000, you could put it on your phone and everyone knew you were rich. I don't know, but it is sort of funny until it got taken down by the App Store. But I think that developer made something like $100,000 because 100 copies of that app were sold before it was taken off. Wow. And anyone who has that now, that phone you could probably sell for maybe $10,000 or who knows how much, but I bet you could eBay that phone for a lot of money because it still has that app on it. And it's sort of a piece of this tech history.
Yeah, totally.
So the NFTs will do this, but I just wanted to point this one out because I think in less of a tongue-in-cheek way and more of an interesting way, I love what he's doing here. So on this one, you can see it's this digital render of a piece, and it just looks like a digital render. So you might think that you're purchasing this. When you start reading about it, he's describing the material, like it's aluminum and the sides and everything. So you get curious, and then you read that the owner of this NFT will also own the physical artwork. This relationship should not be broken. The reserve price is a fabrication budget plus an estimated shipping budget. So what's he doing? He's creating the concept of the artwork. He's putting it on the blockchain, and the blockchain will fund the creation of the artwork. So that's just stupendous. I mean, it opens up these new possibilities because you can have only the concept, but you can't afford to realize the work. And in selling the work, you can realize the work. And I think that is really a summary of what kind of makes this space cool. And who knows where this will go. There's nothing that would bind him if he sold that to actually creating the artwork. So that's the risk of it. Like I said, it's the Wild West. But I think it's super fascinating how people are working in this space and kind of what's possible. Just a couple of famous ones really fast. MF Doom, he passed away recently. Too bad, one of the greatest MCs to live. But his estate, he was always forward thinking, and I think he's a cool character. He's always kind of on the cutting edge of using the iPad and stuff really early on in those days before other artists were using it. And so anyways, it's no surprise that he kind of got into this space very early on and passed away, but his family is using what he was doing as a way to kind of raise some money after he died, which is a cool way to do it. And this is another popular kind of application of these NFTs. So we talked about how they could be videos or sound or something, but very often, if not more often, they are these 3D renders, very compatible for online games or augmented reality or these up and coming technologies like virtual reality. So you might imagine that in a few years, I mean, not that people aren't doing this already, but it could be very commonplace that you're on Facebook and some sort of a virtual world hanging out, and people have these different totems or items on their bodies that are real things that they paid for, or real things that they paid for, and are kind of displaying in a virtual space, similar to that movie Ready Player One or something along those lines. So the most fascinating thing, I think, is it's kind of creating this real life if this then that system. I don't know if many of you know that, but IFTTT was an early thing where you could set up these webhooks that would, if something happened on the internet, then it would trigger this piece of code that would do something else. You could say, okay, if this stock goes to this price, then you should print an I love you note and send it to my girlfriend or something. You know, just completely unrelated things, but this program would allow you to do if this, then that. It's this programmatic kind of state cases. And so some of these NFTs are doing that because it's, if this NFT sells, I will fabricate this piece of art and send it to you. Just kind of fascinating. And I'm sure that it will play out into a lot of interesting situations as performance artists kind of take this. So I think I'll kind of wrap it up there. There's a million things we could talk about. I mean, people are bringing up that these take a lot of energy, like physical energy, watts, because putting them on the blockchain takes something like the same amount of electricity as a house uses in a month or something absurd, or more than that, who even knows. There's a lot of people saying that the NFT market is just going to follow the same patterns that a lot of the kind of bad side of the art world has taken, where these big players make all the money, everyone else is abused, and it's sort of even used by organized crime in a way to stash money and hide it and launder it, which I'm sure is true. But so far, it actually seems to be a progressive force, and it's kind of opening up a lot of these smaller artists to make money, the likes of which had only been able to be made by these, you know, singular kind of figures in the scene before. So yeah, very interesting stuff, and we'd love to know what you guys see or have any thoughts, anything as this class goes on. This stuff is so cutting edge and moving so quickly that even a month ago it wasn't like this. So throughout the next few weeks as we're in this class, I think a lot will evolve as well.
Yeah, 100%. Like the change, it's so dynamic right now. It's so crazy, and that was amazing. There's so many thoughts that provokes, the research and the discussion that you started, for sure. And those pieces are amazing. Sterling Crispin's piece is awesome, man. Just even the visual without even printing it, it's spectacular. The way it moves around the window and stuff like that. And Goldman Sachs.
That's another artist we know, Pepper. He's great.
It's amazing.
This one's pretty impressive.
But yeah, I mean, we are seeing really, really talented artists use this platform to show their work as well. And to a lot of people, they didn't even know these artists existed. So it is really providing a new democratization of art in a really cool way. And in the past, what we saw were more of these marketing silos, that if you wanted to sell art, that you really needed some type of entity to market your art. And so you were getting with a gallery or you're getting with a distributor in order to make money. And so it wasn't like a peer-to-peer situation like's happening here, which is really changing things a lot. There's so many things, once again, that Josh brought up that could be separate discussions altogether that we could cover at some point in time. For example, if this is money laundering, if this is using up too much energy and things like that, and those different topics. But in general, we're just super interested. We hope you guys check them out. It's actually part of today's discussion, and to look deeper into it, and then maybe even think about creating one yourself and putting it up on there. There's different scales as well of galleries, online galleries. The one that Josh is showing right now has a ton of super high-end, really established artists who had been making money making art. They might not have been making it in the traditional sense, but they were maybe doing corporate art or advertising or marketing stuff. But then there's others as well that's more experimental or more nascent in the designs or more even amateurish, like Rarible over there. And they're also selling for really high dollar amounts as well that are more like meme based and things like that. And then lastly, there's the speculation. So a lot of this is speculative because not everything is figured out yet. And some people are just choosing it actually based off of the premise of why people chose the best art, to have the first, to have something that's valuable as a historic landmark and things like that. So super cool stuff. And that was an awesome description of it. If anybody has comments or thoughts, please put it in the chat. We'll be happy to address that stuff. Honestly, don't want to stop talking about this stuff, to be totally honest, but let's move on to the next topic, which is how to kind of analyze some of this stuff. And I'm going to talk about the concepts maybe in a little bit on a 10,000 foot perspective and talk about the concepts themselves. And then I'm going to give you guys the materials to read over and read through. And after that, you guys can look through them and try to apply them to some NFTs that you might have found. So let's check some of that stuff out. Okay, so for the creative process, I'm kind of breaking things down into three different categories: kernel, vapor, and oil. And so kernel is something that Aristotle would have called substance. It's the things that's something that's tangible, right? Vapor is something that's not tangible. That might be something that, for example, Plato in his the allegory of a cave, the people who are just staring at a wall are imagining what the world might be. So it's things that might not have as much substance. And then oil is the networked quality. So that could be something tangible like a kernel, or something not tangible like vapor as well. And it's just including an extra element into the cycle of when we're trying to design and come up with ideas. And this is really based around idea generation or analysis of different ideas. So like when we go back and we look at there was a picture of a field that you showed of an NFT where a paintbrush started creating grass, right? And so the physical or the tangible kernels are the actual things that we're seeing, but then there's something intangible there too, right? Something magical in that environment that's being included as one of the parameters that make that design and provide quality to it and characteristics to it. So to describe kind of what kernels are, we try to define them so that you can think about what things might be kernels, mainly things that are tangible. So what are things that are tangible? Things like volume, weight, that have volume, weight, speed, area, height, length, things along those lines. Maybe that paintbrush that was moving along the field. Kernels are visibly apparent or quantifiable to the viewer via the comparison between different objects. For example, the length of a block, the number of votes in an election, the size of a house, the color of a frog, and so on. Vapor, on the other hand, is a qualitative data or value, something that is intangible, that's something that isn't necessarily tangible to the viewer, and refers to representations that are intellectual. Value is not that tangible things can't be intellectual at the same point, but are often best described and often not explicitly measured. So things that can be a vapor could be an emotion, a belief, a memory. They could be reflective, like overconsumption. They could be a state of mind, like triumph or motivation. They could be interactive, like the feeling of sandpaper or window glare. They could be a physical reaction, something feeling hot or cold. And they could be sound, like a high pitched noise. Well, I have some stars on some of these because some of them are kind of irregular and could fall in multiple different categories. And it's okay to play with them on the side of the different categories. Oil parameter are associated data or network data. So associated data are parameters that share proximity or origin to each other. So network data are parameters that connect via sequential representation or shared elements of external or internal dependency. So for example, examples of origin could be paella, flamenco, the Catalan language, which would be the origin from Spanish, or memory foam, water filters, solar energy, which could have been created by NASA. So thinking about a single object and then thinking about how that could be networked to other objects as well. Examples of proximity could be vegetable milk and eggs, which are found in like a refrigerator. E.T. premieres in the theater. Stevie Wonder releases Abracadabra. The first CD player sold. All happened in 1982. Or the Golden Gate Bridge, Fisherman's Wharf, Alcatraz, all things located in San Francisco. So proximity can play upon itself in many different ways with these associated elements. So for the oil parameter, examples of external dependency could be a nail to wood, plants and animals, which would be both dependent on the sun, or nail to wood, a hammer. Internal dependencies could be bread, chips, and pasta, which are dependent on flour, boat, plane, car, dependent on gasoline, so on and so forth. You can think of many different things that are dependent upon each other, and those things would be considered networked, or the oil parameter that we're referring to. Other ways could be sequential, which is in order of which they appear, like an egg, a chicken, and a rooster as the growth. And there's many other examples that we have here. Then there's some stars for irregulars. I'll let you guys go through and check out the irregulars in more depth later, but temperature and sound levels are actually vapor, and they could also have specific values. So they're categorized as vapor because in 2D or 3D design, sound and temperature are not tangible to the viewer. So we're thinking about essentially things that have aesthetic properties, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't use this for sound as well. You probably would have to change some of the ways that you categorize stuff, but essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to think of different parameters to include in a design that gives that design complexity. And there's many critics of art that look back at, one of them, David Pagel, who's a writer for the LA Times, says that when you go to look at a painting, there's the and then there's a moment, right? Some art that we'll even see, definitely some of the NFT stuff like Neon Cat has the wow factor, right? But there's not necessarily a whole lot of thinking that goes on. There's not necessarily a whole lot of additional complexity to Neon Cat. Although you might think of the complexity now as Neon Cat being this meme and representative of a moment in time, right? So it might have accumulated that vapor over time. And you might say, yeah, well, Neon Cat was, what was it? 2007 or something like that, and it just took over the internet, and it was part of the meme culture that is now a big part of our lives and probably one of the most famous memes ever, right? So because of that, it might have that vapor value, talking about a time and a place or an emotion or a feeling that people had at that period of time that you can now attach to the tangible look of a cat flying through the sky with rainbows behind it, right? But if we are artists and designers, we want to try to embed that complexity into the design in the first place. And this is one of the ways that you can do it. by thinking about different parameters that you're going to try to incorporate into a design. And in the beginning of that design process, when you just have a blank piece of paper, it's as simple as just brainstorming things to put together on that paper, and then inspecting those things later and figuring out what you want to tease from them in order to integrate things together later on down the road. Color is an irregular property because it's technically could fit in both categories as well, for many different reasons. For example, there's a brown toad frog, which is the name of the frog, and the color is the identity of, you know, the scientific taxonomy of that frog. But then you might make a frog, you know, red, and the color red in that case is actually vapor, by saying you're trying to maybe embed something like it's a devil frog or it's in love frog or something along those lines, by using the color red as vapor in order to interact with that frog and demonstrate more meaning from it. And so I go into some examples here on that as color being vapor and things like that. Here's an example of Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times. It's a movie that critically looks at life changes during the Industrial Revolution. Kind of exciting, like right now, it feels like we are in some type of revolution of sorts with this whole cryptocurrency, with the pandemic. I mean, there's many things that aren't exciting about it, but the amount of change that's happening right now is at least very thought-provoking and providing a lot of substance for us to consider and think about. And hopefully we can harness that to motivate ourselves in a positive way. The Industrial Revolution, of course, probably one of the most famous periods in history where that was happening. And Charlie Chaplin was making black and white films. And this film was to show more socialist principles against the robber barons of the times, who were sending people just in masses to the factories to work under conditions that weren't necessarily the greatest. And so he has side-by-side cuts in the film of one, people walking up and down the subways, and then secondly of sheep running. And so what he's doing is he's using sheep as that vapor to show some type of emotion or characteristic or sensibility about the thinking of sheep as they move, which, as we know, when sheep are moving, they're not necessarily very high of intellectual thought, right? And so he's juxtaposing that against the people running up the stairs in order to provide the context of the tangible people who are running up the stairs, and then the vapor of these sheep that are moving, and the sensibility of that. And so putting those two things together, you could see it adds more complexity of the messaging of people running up the stairs in the subway. So that kind of covers kernel, vapor, and oil. If you guys have questions, please put them in the chat. And you could also put them in the Discord. We could try to also follow that kind of stuff as well while we're trying to do this. Do you have any thoughts on any of this stuff that I brought up in the first place, Josh? I know I kind of rambled through a bunch of stuff.
No, I always just love that. That's like one of those early film examples are some of the most effective. And I'm not sure why that was. It's just, I guess, like with any medium, sort of the early days are the most interesting, I find. There's something about that space. And I think those early pioneers of film just have the best way of quickly showing concepts and making their point with very little at their disposal, like no sound,
right.
You know, just images.
They had to cut, literally film together. They didn't have like digital transitions and stuff like that. So it's like very raw, literally just like a jump cut to sheep running, you know, like.
Yeah. And just the fact that they weren't drawing off of anything else, I guess, established their sort of beginner's mind and maybe allowed them to come up with those techniques so quickly, but it's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Highly recommend it. If any of the students haven't seen those films, do check them out.
100%. Modern Times is a great one, and a lot of Charlie Chaplin stuff, and how artistic, right? Because he knew that he was going to get people, because there's this new technology for people just to go to the cinema and watch these type of things. The cinema itself was an experience at that time, if we can only imagine, right? To us now, the cinema is hardly an experience. It's takes up probably at least 2 or 3 hours of our day for some of us, just watching TV or watching content. Back then it was like, holy cow, there's this thing on a screen. Um, but then he adds the extra layer where he's trying to send some type of messages artistically via metaphor and things like that to the viewers. It just shows how artistic and ahead of their times they were as artists, which is pretty amazing, that they wanted to add that kind of density to the narratives. So the first part is understanding parameters, right? Like really just breaking things down to their core contents. And then the next part are, what are like the we were talking a little bit about algorithms, like algorithms of design. What are some algorithms you could use of those parameters in order to make something maybe a little bit more complex, or add maybe a different tone or a different flair to it, or look at it through another lens. And a lot of times we have to kind of force ourselves to do that and put ourselves either outside of our comfort zone or shine a lens on something in order to make it that way. Some of us do it naturally, right? Back in the day, people would be like, oh, he's an artist or she's an artist, because they just did it naturally. But anybody can do it as long as you just use these tools and you kind of put them through that quote unquote algorithm or through that funnel, right? And you know what you have at the beginning, and then you try to process that through different stages, and you see what you get at the end. You see what experiment is created. So 3 of those algorithms that we kind of talk about, which seem to be pretty accessible, are fences, buckets, and layers. And once again, of course, not of course, if you try to Google these terms, they're not going to appear except in this presentation. We're just trying to come up with some type of language to speak about these things that make it more accessible. They're just made up. I made them up based off of that. So,
but it's basically common patterns of artistic constraints that many artists use. These are very common patterns that Justin's laid out, I'd say.
Yeah, so. Totally. And yeah, it's just kind of giving more, I guess, accessible terms to them, right? So in the previous chapter, we discussed different ways that a designer can classify parameters. Now we'll take a look at different ways that a designer can structure our projects with usage of those parameters. So one of them is fence, buckets, and then layers. And visually, I think that it's also really helpful based off of kind of the term that they have. So a fence structure is a constraint. So at the beginning of a project, a designer can select which parameters they'd like to use. First, you have your tangible elements that are networked together, right? And then after that, you could put some constraints around them. Oftentimes when people use constraints, surprising enough, more ideas are fostered by putting a constraint on you than by having the entire world open to you. It's pretty amazing. And then it also can put some really specific emphasis to that design or that piece that you're trying to create. So for example, a constraint might be, I'm only going to design stuff. I'm only going to use elements that all of my elements somehow have to correlate to 1929. I don't know what happened in 1929, but you could do a specific date, right? Or all of my elements that are within all the parameters I chose have to be in the context that their value with monetary value they all have to be under $10, or this whole project has to be created in under $10. How do I do that? By putting those constraints, it puts you into this fence, or this constraint area where you really have to think about, okay, how does this change based on the constraints that I have? Some people will look at it in the reverse, where they'll give themselves the constraints and then they'll select their parameters and their objects from that point forward, right? So I'm stuck in Alaska in a cabin. I'm going to make my entire art piece just with the things that are around me. The constraints are that I can only use the things around me in a cabin in Alaska, right? And then the work that comes from that is very specific and often has the characteristics of, that cabin in Alaska. And then, please read these later where I go into more detail of some of the examples um, where I illustrate more. Feel free to jump in at any time as well, Josh. And then the second is buckets. So buckets are brainstorming, right? So you're just taking a whole bunch of stuff, you're putting them into one bucket, and you're looking at how they work together, and you're choosing which ones you want to keep using and which ones you want to throw out and stuff like that. So if you think about an empty shopping cart, you can then fill this bucket. So we could see here that you have an empty shopping cart, and then they're filling the bucket, for example, with plants. Not necessarily something that we would have associated with the shopping cart, but by fusing them both together, what's the reaction you're going to get from people? Oh, how artistic, right? Oh, that's really creative, right? But really what it is it's just taking ideas and seeing how they mold together and how they play with each other and work with each other. Here's different ways of using the shopping cart, by the way. Who would have thought that shopping carts could be so versatile? The next part is layer. So layers usually begin with a strong element that is defining the design. And if we think about it in marketing or advertising, it doesn't have to be along those lines. I often like to think of the Olympics. So if you have the Olympic rings, you bring up an image of the Olympic rings, and these are an extremely prominent and well-known design that articulates the Olympics, right? But whenever you see the Olympics appear in different places, you see it take on a different layer. They add a layer on top of that meaning that often is representative of their country or the time they're living in or the type of design aesthetic they want to have. And we could see up here, we have, this is Banksy, by the way, who just did something really interesting with NFTs that maybe we'll talk about next week. So this
I didn't know he'd done something. That's funny.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. What would you say?
I didn't know Banksy had graffitied the NFT space.
We could talk about it at the end of class, actually, if you'd like. So you could see Banksy's version of the Olympic rings. This is Tokyo's version of the Olympic rings. Here, I like Brazil's too. I'm going to do Brazil. Let's go back to, and then Brazil's Olympic rings. Well, here's some examples. But when they had the Olympics, it really had, here we go. It really felt like, is this Belarus? Oh, okay. So this is Belarus's version of it. And where is?
And I think it's from Rio. But maybe it was for the Belarusian team. Maybe that's what they won at the Rio Olympics.
Yeah, this looks like the Rio design. But you could see how they chose the font. You could see the layering that they did on this. They did a really nice job. Here's another example here, where you still have the Olympic rings, but you're adding layers on top of it. Another example could be if you're looking at like the Home Depot logo and how that changes over the year, right? Here's another example of how Rio created their own unique way of playing with the rings that fits their culture. The color, of course, plays a role, but then they also think about how can I play with the design in order to be more representative of our culture in Rio. I mean, you could even see the font choice there, which is much more playful, more water-like, which is very important to people in Brazil, right?
Yeah, I always think of this layer version, maybe from the audio world, but sort of like an audio mashup, or if you have, an Outcast song being done by a rock band. So you still have the original, but you have the rock band, and the sum is the sort of layered, new, refracted meaning from both.
Yeah, I love that.
That adopts the qualities.
Acoustic version of, or like a symphony version of Metallica and stuff like
that. Yeah. You can hear both at the same time. It's sort of and both have their own layered meanings
Yeah.
that have their own associations and kind of coming from different spots. And it's this blended
100%.
pastiche.
100%. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, so that's what we have here. So what we'd like you to do this week, we'd like you to go and find NFTs. Go look. You just have to do a Google search now, which is nice. NFT marketplace. I'm pretty sure you'll get tons of different options. And the goal is read through those materials, try to understand what kernel, vapor, and oil are. And here first, we have you kind of, we have other examples. Here's an example of constraints and an artist talking about constraints. So please check that out and write a few sentences about that. So that's fences, which is constraints. And then buckets and brainstorming. Here's another really cool resource from the Powers of 10 about brainstorming and creating buckets and reframe and things like that for your designs. And then after that, we have layers, and some of these elements can be used in a lot of different things, but going back to these terms that we know real well, like metaphors and analogies, similes and allegory, parables and fables and things like that. And just looking back through those elements and kind of re-ingratiating ourselves with the material to imagine different ways that we could use parameters and and kind of extract more meaning out of those parameters and their interactions with other things to give creative thought or give creative ideas that are unique. And then, so that's more of a writing exercise. You don't have to design anything for that, but feel free to draw stuff and design stuff if you feel so empowered. And then the second part is to find an NFT that uses kernels, vapor, and oil. So find an NFT, choose that NFT, and then break down what you think is the kernel, the vapor, and then the oil elements of that NFT, and write about those parameters. And then find another NFT that incorporates metaphor of an analogy, a simile or allegory, or a parable or a fable. And then just submit that. That's what we have for you this week. Are there any thoughts on any of that stuff? Okay, well, I will show the last NFT of today, and looking forward to discussing a lot of NFTs over this semester. And looking forward to you guys creating NFTs. You know, in our classes, we've had experience where in social media marketing, people created social media marketing campaigns that created real buzz and ended up in, I'm trying to think of the name. I wanted to say Slashdot, but it's not.
BuzzFeed or
yeah, it was BuzzFeed was one of the places that it was aggregated, and there was also in this geek blog.
Favorite Pill, maybe. Yeah.
That's really popular. I can't think of its name off the top of my head. And it started in the class, and then it got major buzz. It was really awesome. So I'd love to see one of our NFTs from this class get sold for a couple of Ethereums. Why not? I think that's something doable. And we'll talk more about NFTs and ways that we can create them to be sold as well. And that would be a great proof of assessment of the class if our students are making money in the class before.
Yeah, it was Boing Boing. One of our students got on Boing Boing for this political campaign.
Yes.
That was a nice moment.
So Banksy literally burned one of his paintings and turned it into an NFT. And the NFT, I actually saw the NFT for sale 3 days ago, and it started off an auction at like $5,000. I was considering, I was going to contact Josh, and I was going to consider seeing, you know, it's very tempting to own a Banksy for that kind of money, right?
We have a student who was trying to steal a Banksy.
That's right. It ended up selling for $382,000. Clearly very underpriced.
Yeah, we should have done it.
Well, it wasn't you know, at the end, all the prices go up, and then, you know,
Yeah.
but if it was $5,000, if it sold for $5,000, I might have probably regretted that 10 years down the road, right? Um,
Right.
but as we all know, Banksy is probably one of the most famous artists currently around. And what a cool kind of metaphor that he literally burns one of his famous pieces and then resells it as an NFT. So he literally takes something that's physical, makes it digital, and I wonder if he made more money on it. That would be my question.
Right.
Than if he had sold it for physical. And then Beeple that you were talking about that sold it for like $6 million, right? I'm surprised this
Yeah.
didn't sell for more. I mean, it is Banksy after all, right? Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, were these pound? Yeah, it's dollars. And then Beeple ended up selling at Christie's a physical piece later on. I don't know what it sold for, but after his digital NFT got so popular, he then sold a physical piece at
Yeah. We're
Christie's.
seeing a nice crossover, the digital artist going physical and physical going digital.
Yeah. I think in general, the most exciting thing about this is just the energy towards art and creation of these things, which clearly during the pandemic was dead, right? Like more than ever. Galleries aren't open and things like that. And with this blossoming of art and art makers, and then getting paid ridiculous amounts of money, is is amazing and
Well,
deservedly.
it's nice too. I mean, the fact that it opened up a way to own in a semi-respected sense a digital artwork is, I think that's important because it's been trouble a lot. I mean, I've even been involved in a project and we were trying to sell editions of a digital artwork, and they physically come on a Mac Mini, so it's like an edition of 12, but that doesn't seem to resonate. Somehow this resonates in a way that I don't think anything else really has. Um, I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting that it did, and it kind of makes sense in retrospect. But
Yeah.
I couldn't have predicted it the way it happened.
No, and people really are, they're in it for the possibility right now. The dollars that we're seeing, a lot of those people, they cannot be sure of how this thing's going to go, but they're in it almost as a political stance too, saying, I mean, some of them are probably just like, I want to be the first and there's value there. So they're just extremely bullish and they're gambling essentially. But then there's other people that are buying it that we're seeing that are really in it as a political moment of saying, this is really interesting. I want to help foster this. But in general, we don't know where the rights are going to go. We don't know what copyright means in this realm, or what happens to this piece, or or where it's even stored. Right? You could store it locally, but they say it's stored on the blockchain. But it's quite a controversial point to say, because I don't think the blockchain can store images. So it's going to be really interesting to see where this goes for sure. So cool. That's what we have for you guys this week. We'll hang around for a little bit after that, but everybody have a great week, and thanks for attending. I'll go over here to the chat, and if anybody has any questions or comments, uh, please send them our way. We'd love to chat about it.
Where's the link?
Here, I'll send it to you. There's also quite a delay too, so
Static reaction. I might be watching.
there
If it
you
is
go.
unavailable, it's private.
Put it
Okay,
in
yeah.
the chat, the link.
Thank you.
By the way, I edit this video, and when I edit it,